Thank you for that brief introduction. Morning, everyone. Thank you for sharing this time and my story with me. I know listening to somebody else's story sometimes is interesting, sometimes it's intriguing, and at times it could also get boring. So feel free to move around, get up, stretch, whatever you need to do to keep yourselves energized. Okay, so as I was briefly introduced, my name is Darshana Kanabar. I work for the Taxation and Revenue Department. And at a state level, PCI-related initiatives are going on at a broader scale. I just wanted to clarify that this discussion is all about me and my story from my perspective and the journey that I went through a few years ago when we embarked on achieving PCI compliance. So any characters, incidents that may be heard today are purely coincidental. Any potential resemblances or conflicts are unintentional. So with that, let's get on. The story started way back in 2016 when I took up a new position, my current position with the State of New Mexico's Taxation and Revenue Department. When I was brought on board, I was told about some huge legacy system modernization initiatives that were underway. Some were struggling to take off. And then there were some where funds were at risk, so they needed to be accelerated. Then procurement streamlining, IT operations streamlining, just the usual stuff that you would anticipate. So I knew that I had to have the patience, perseverance. There might be some phishing activities, right, that tested my patience. I knew I was in for that. I knew there might be some treacherous hikes along the way, some beautiful turns around the way that I would encounter. I was ready for that. I also knew that there might be some skies and starry nights on a camping trip with some of the initiatives. I was prepared for that. But I also knew that there might be stuff and initiatives and items along the way or moments along the way where I might need some help from somebody's wins to help keep my sails afloat. So I was prepared for a journey of a lifetime when I took up this position. I knew that Taxation and Revenue Department, IT, was a fast-paced environment, and there were these items that needed attention. That is why I was there. But to my surprise, I was told after a year, within the first year of my onboarding, that I had to deal with something known as PCI. Now, whenever you take up a new position in a new industry, my prior background was with IT and health. In a new industry, you deal with an alphabet soup of jargons and, we all go through that. This was a new acronym for me. I had heard about it, but I never paid much attention to it. PCI as in payment card industry, followed by DSS, data security standards. And I'm like, okay, so what is that? So let me give you a little bit about what that is and how that ties into what we do. So Taxation and Revenue Department houses two major lines of business. For those of you that may not be too familiar, we oversee over 33 different types of tax programs within the state of New Mexico. And then on the other side, we provide all the motors, drivers, and vehicle services through our motor vehicles division or line of business. So for an IT shop, it was like serving two major organizations, two completely different lines of businesses, right? And at the time, we accepted card payments for anybody who walked into our office, anybody who would take our services online, and then over the phone. So that was the context. And back in about 2014, so before I was hired, the state of New Mexico was informed by Wells Fargo, our state fiscal agent, that we had reached the threshold or crossed the threshold of 1 million transactions, and we were now required to be PCI compliant at a different level. So here I am, unraveling the story and still gathering information. Okay, so what? Well, I found out that payment card industry sets standards for us to follow. The very first version was released back in 2004. The latest version, which is the current version, 3.2, came out in 2016. So there was a new set of standards out there in that same year. And there wasn't much information that I could count on to be available around in terms of resources to help me come up to speed. Anyways, so the state's primary merchant provider, Wells Fargo, informed us that the state of New Mexico as a whole now needs to get compliant. At the time, about 23 different state agencies were accepting card payments. And we were told that we were amongst the top, volume-wise, amongst the top of the tier. Now, to help the state achieve compliance sooner, under Visa's Compliance Acceleration Program, we were also fortunate to be charged fines per month. Month after month after month, we had to pay fines until the time we achieved compliance. So that just adds to the complexity, right? You have to now, so I am in charge. I have been handed a brand new budget that I have to balance, right? I have to find ways to streamline my budget. And this is another item that's going to hit my budget that was unplanned for. And for some reason, it was surprising that this was perceived as a technology problem and that IT had to solve and IT had to pay for until it is resolved. So all of this I'm uncovering and I'm like, okay, oh my gosh, now where do I go? And what do I do? This is what it seemed like. As enchanting as the journey was, I was excited to learn about something new. It was quite an uphill challenge because it wasn't an organization initiative. And think about it, we were accepting card payments for years. We have been issuing driver's licenses for years. When you walk up to a counter, you make a card payment. That was in place. So why touch something that's not broken, right? How do you combat that? Just because you are required to? That doesn't cut it. Compliance, regulatory requirements. Well, our organization is one of the most heavily governed entity, if you will. We have external oversight from the IRS, from the Social Security Administration, from annual financial assessments. We also had LFC assess a variety of our programs. We have an internal audit unit, and we have an investigation fraud team. So it's like, we are highly compliant with all of those things. What are we doing wrong, right? So that was hard to combat. And then we had all these different channels of payment. So I knew it was going to be an uphill journey, an uphill battle, because this was not a project on the cards. We had to deal with legacy system modernization. We were in the midst of implementing or modernizing our flagship motor vehicles services system, which is currently in place. We were heavily in the midst of organizing our on-guard program, which was struggling for years before I took office. We were in the midst, well, not in the midst, we had to get a new project off the ground, which would modernize our property tax, the way they do business, entire program. That was struggling to get off ground. So there were a lot of these high priority, high visibility things, and then this comes along. So we knew it was an uphill battle. Well, that wasn't it. There's more to the story. So we were being told in 2016, our Department of Finance and Administration, which is a state central oversight entity for finance related aspects, they were able to get some funding and they did a gap assessment for individual agencies and the state as a whole. And guess how we did in that? In some areas, we were like in single digits, all in all, we were like about 20% compliance. So it's hard to human tendency, right? You start with denial. You're telling me my processes are broken when I'm doing this for years and we're doing it securely and we have oversight, right? You're telling us that this is broken and there are gaps here and gaps there. So the initial, I do not think that there was huge buy-in from our internal agency stakeholders. The business, they had heard about it, but there was no incentive to do anything about it. It became an IT problem. How do you combat that? To add to that, our current card processor that we used at the time, I won't name them because they're no longer a provider, their agreement had come to an end and we were in an emergency extension. So that solution was not PCI compliant. And I don't think they had any incentive because we did not have a long-term agreement now with them. We were in an emergency extension for just that year. What incentive would they had to invest in, helping us get compliant and upgrading their solution? There was no incentive. So before we touched before we did anything with our PCI compliance, job number one now became to go and do a procurement, a competitive RFP to find another solution provider. Okay, so now we had to define our requirements. Nobody knew much about this to have that proficiency level to define our requirement set. We didn't know what we would look for, right? So those were all the challenges. We were fined on a monthly basis, so the time was ticking. We needed new agreements in place. We need, all our service channels were out there and service could not be disrupted. And our processes had huge gaps in them that needed, to be filled. So that was a scenario that was presented to the CIO's office by our executive management, the cabinet secretary, on one fine evening. I still remember it was dark outside. And we were in my boss's office with the secretary, and he said, I need IT to take this on because this is not going anywhere, and we got to get this done. Okay, it was time for me to take off my deputy CIO hat and then put on multiple hats: project manager, stakeholder coordinator, procurement manager, risk analyzer, and whatever else it took hat to get this thing off the ground. Step number one that we took, myself and my boss, our CIO, is let's make this into a formal project because there are way too many moving pieces. There is too many things to be done. Let's make this into a formal executive organization-wide project, and then we'll have sub-projects underneath it. Because that's the only way we are going to get all the stakeholders to come join us. It's not just a technology solution, right? The front end customer service is going to be impacted, and we need everybody to have buy-in and a seat at the table. So we did that. Fortunately, we had support. And so acceptance was our first step. We accepted, we got to do this. And then we set up a team. We had sub-projects underneath it. There were two major areas of my focus. One is to get the procurement rolling for our service provider, because that would be a big chunk to get us into compliance quickly. And then we were struggling to write our requirements for that. So we were fortunate enough to find somebody who was experienced in acquirer services type procurement industry. His name was Art Berger. We recruited him to help us develop our requirements and help us write the RFP, and that RFP had to go through, the oversight review approval process, which takes time because we as a state were not as mature at the time in our oversight processes as we are today. So the oversight entities, did not have standards and policies and guidance on what they would like to see in this kind of a procurement. So there were more questions than we would have liked, which took time. For good reasons. So we went through that process, step number one. In parallel, when I reviewed our gap assessment for the tax and rev department, we tried to find low-hanging fruits. What are the biggest areas that would give us the biggest return on investment with little, effort right now? And that was documentation, processes, policies, right? And the team had a lot of other initiatives at their hands. So nobody knew how to write these and how to update these. So for that, we had to do a small PO, get some external help to help us update our processes and policies and to keep that ball rolling. So that was number two. And then number three was a bunch of other sub-initiatives, one on the tax side, one on the motor vehicle side, so on and so forth. We did realize that it was too much. We had 3 payment channels on each, not on each side. On the motor vehicle side, we had in-person, online, and over the phone. On the tax side, we had online, not in person, and over the phone. So So we had about 5 or 6 channels that we had to deal with, which was a lot. The other challenge that we had is the way our infrastructure landscape was built. It had evolved over time. It's easier when you're doing this from the grounds up, where you can architect and design your infrastructure to meet a certain need. That makes it a lot easier. And here we were, where there was turnover before us in IT, and the infrastructure ecosystem was complex, it was broad, widespread, and there was lack of standardization. It had just evolved over time. So in that landscape, without any impact to service, having to make these changes was difficult. It wasn't an easy task, right? But we had to start somewhere. So we kept on analyzing each of these areas. One of the options we looked into was network segmentation or segregation. We have over 85 at the time, just in the motor vehicles area, over 85 field offices. And we had to deploy over 300 point of sale devices with lack of standardization on the endpoints. It was not an easy job. So we needed a lot of help. We knew that. We took that opportunity. The CIO's office was very, very, very supportive. We took that opportunity to actually implement organizational agility. I do remember the whole procurement to get a new service provider on board took, all in all, from start to finish, 18 months. Despite the urgency, despite having the topmost level of support, it took that long a time. Guess what that did? We had to be compliant by October of 2018. And here we are in January of 2018, still struggling to complete our procurement. By the time the procurement was completed and a contract was in place, we had about 3 to less than 4 months to actually transition from an old service provider to a new one, to complete all the planning, complete all the implementation and deployment through all these field offices. It was a task that needed more helping hands. So what we did under organizational agility within IT is we identified resources that could be redirected to help us, especially during testing, training, and command control phases, right? During the last few weeks, it was just a fight to the finish. It was home run. We took in anybody who had some bandwidth and who was ready to help: application developers, desktop support, network engineers, business subject matter experts, contractors, our application system contractor, and our card service provider. And we blocked off our large conference room, our large training rooms, and there was a command control room set up. And it was weekends, long weekends, days and nights, whatever it took. I remember getting food for people, to coffee, to making copies, to providing guidance and coaching, and at times stepping back and letting them take on whatever it took. We as a team worked on it and finally made it happen. I think there were a couple of tips I'd like to share from this part of the journey. So this was how we did it. The next part of the presentation will focus on what it all entails to get PCI compliance, but the how we did it, I'd like to share a few lessons learned and tips for anybody who may want to embark on something like this, even if it's an upgrade to an existing compliance level that you're working on. One is managing something as a project. It gives you formal structure around something. It helps you keep track of your critical path, your schedules. It helps you it provides you with tools to communicate with your stakeholders. And they had been hearing about us having to be PCI compliant for 2 years before that time, but nothing had happened, right? The only way we were able to get buy-in was after we made it into a formal project, and we were able to talk about risks in tangible terms and the impact to them. The direct impact to the citizens was, were tools that we were able to leverage. So managing it as a formal project was very helpful. Second, when you do manage it as a formal project, something like this would be better managed by a member of a senior management team, like we did. The CIO's office manage this as a project, as opposed to handing it over to our project management office. Now, it's not to say that the project management office wouldn't do a good job and it wouldn't be successful. No, that's definitely not the case. But you got to given the time frame that we had like 3 months, and this is huge, right? You've got to have the top level buy-in. There's no other way. Even getting the contract approved through the oversight entities, as I said, our maturity level today has evolved, but back then things were new. Everybody was learning and we were evolving as it went. So there were questions we were not prepared for. And in those kind of situations, responses from the top management was really helpful. Our CIO was completely engaged, and we were hand in glove in this, and we were tag teaming and handling the queries appropriately. So that helps. Thirdly, finding a good solution provider goes a very, very long way, because oftentimes these services do not work in isolation. The service provider that we ended up recruiting, or who ended up winning the contract, their name is Grand Street Group. Excellent, excellent partner. Their solution is great. They are very responsive. Even they were very patient and very supportive, and provided every bit of detail multiple times during the entire contracting process and even thereafter. The other advantage, as I said, of a service provider is, yes, their solution is compliant, fully compliant, and whatever they have to go through, that you have vetted through the process. But my applications have different set of interfaces, and those are all different contractors and vendors. And these kind of systems have to interact and interface with all these other systems. So you want a service provider who's going to be a team and a partner with all these other vendors that you have involved in your ecosystem. Otherwise, you will have to focus on dealing with those issues, and it's generally not pleasant when that happens, when you don't have two vendors able to work with each other, right? So finding a good service provider was one thing that we got very, very lucky on. The next thing is be agile and be nimble. As I mentioned, there were times when I had to step away from the situation. In the last weekend of our go live, when the pin pad devices were being rolled out to the offices, it was like we did not have the luxury of having any downtime. We had to do it over 1 weekend, 2 days, right? We're talking about 330 some point of sale devices to be deployed to over 80 field offices. We focused on the motor vehicle side first. By that point, we had shut off our over the phone service channel. We wanted to focus on our highest priority service channels first, gain some success there, and then build on top of that. So during the last weekend, it was nights and days, patience, perseverance, and a lot of time understanding the details is what it would take. So the next part of my presentation would focus on sharing some of those details in PCI that might be beneficial or of value to somebody who is in that situation right now. Okay. You start, whenever you embark on having to have a new card processing facility for your customers, you always start with who you are or what your role is in the PCI ecosystem. And there are many, many roles. And of course, a lot of it is not black and white. Sometimes a same entity might play multiple roles. Okay. So as I mentioned, in the PCI ecosystem, what is your role? If you are an entity that is providing a service and accepting a card for payment, you are likely a merchant. If you are a payment processor, like the Grand Street that I mentioned, or some of the others, our bank, right? If you are an entity that facilitates the payment from the payee, the entire payment rail, which is a pipeline that transmits money from the payee to the recipient, then you are likely a payment processor. So depending on your role might be you are like one of these vendors that we have that has a solution to support payment processing. So depending on your role in the ecosystem, the requirements that apply to you and the standards that apply to you for PCI compliance might vary. So identifying your role is important and where we start. For us, the way I look at it is State of New Mexico is one full entity. that has to be compliant, and we are one aspect of it, so I could be a sub-merchant from that perspective. Likewise, Grand Street Group is a payment facilitator. They work the payment rails, and they work with something called as WorldPay, who is the actual payment processor that works with the card companies. So for them, all their customers are sub-merchant, and they call themselves the merchant because they are doing all this transaction processing on behalf of us. So as I said, it's kind of a gray area. You would have to work with your service provider to help you understand and define your role. Once you've understood your role in the PCI ecosystem, the next thing you do is identify what level you are at. Okay. If you are a small, a business owner, let's say, doing under 20,000 transactions per month, you could be a level 4. If you are, about 20,000 and up to $1 million, you could be a level 3. 1 million to 6 million, you could be a level 2, and above 6 million, you could be a level 1. Again, just the volume of transactions doesn't define it alone. There's a risk component that goes along with it, and certain other technicalities like complexity and the risk involved. But your card company and your service provider will be able to work with you in identifying your service level as you go. So your role and the level of service and the complexity and risk involved, that defines the requirements that are applicable to you. Okay, and depending on the requirements applicable to you, you would have to do one or more of these things. You could do as simple as a self-assessment questionnaire, which is, you are saying that I'm compliant based on these are the answers. I'm answering yes to everything. If it's a no, then you have to explain in detail. Or you might have to go through quarterly scans through an ASV. It's called a qualified, an authorized scanning vendor. You would have to create an attestation of compliance, or you would have to do something like an external auditor. A qualified auditor has to come and audit you and then create a report of compliance. So depending on your role and your level, these requirements are defined. And again, there are scenarios to it. There is no black and white answer. So the theme of my presentation is also gray, but that's probably true for a lot of oversight and regulatory items, I guess. At a very, very broad level, when I first saw, the requirements, there were like close to 300 requirements, all in all, right, under various control groups, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I like to take a big problem, and to wrap my head around it, I like to dwindle it down to more manageable size chunk and something my brain can comprehend. So at a very broad level, this is how I looked at the problem and I categorized it during my journey. The most amount of requirements, of course, were related to the technology. How is your risk management, vulnerability management, and all the technical components that are involved in your, what they call card data environment. So the entire environment that is used from the point when a card transaction starts to the end of it, that makes your environment, all the technological components involved in it would form your technology group. How well that interacts with the processes, policies behind the scenes that need to make that function, that is the next group. And then the people, the training, and all that is involved in the people component of it. So all of these three have to work hand in hand, and how well that interacts with each other to keep your card data environment as secure as possible. That is, in a simplest way, what this compliance is all about. So if you look at it from that perspective, you'll be able to narrow down and have focus areas and be able to focus your efforts in bridging your gaps if you ever have to go through this kind of a journey. Okay, so right since the inception, I tend to move. If my volume gets low, please tell me. I need to be glued to the spot. Okay. So right since version 1 of the PCI DSS standards, these were the major control objectives. They've not changed to date. The major umbrellas or control objectives of what they look at when they give you the requirements and ask you to be compliant. It's pretty standard stuff or self-explanatory. They look at how the cardholder data is handled, how secure your network systems are, what access control measures you have in place, your policies, how well you manage your risk and vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. Then from these major control objective groups, they are further broken down into what was applicable to us as a merchant at the time, into 12 different sets of requirements, which are then further broken down into multiple requirements to add up to those up to 300. So not all 300 may be applicable to one single entity. I think for us, there are about close to under 200 requirements that are applicable, that were applicable at the time. But at a very high level, those requirements and within those control groups are broken down into 12 high-level requirements with further sub-requirements and sub-controls under each of those. Okay. And again, these would vary. So if you are a card service provider, you would have something else. If you are, a different type of entity, something else might be applicable to you. This is what was in our gap assessment done by RiskSense in 2016 and what was applicable to us as a merchant at the time. It's interesting, so back in the day, if I were to walk into an MVD field office to renew, to complete a transaction, the way it would work is I would hand my card to the clerk. They would process it behind the counter and then give me a confirmation. The same thing would happen over the phone. If I would call to complete a transaction, I would provide them my card information. They would complete the transaction and the clerk on the other side would enter that into the system, into my application and give me a confirmation. Not quite compliant, isn't it? Little did I think, whenever I went to a grocery store or whatever, right, when I would swipe my card, I did not pay attention to all that's involved behind the scenes. I think there's good reasons to it. Wouldn't you want to ensure that your information is as secure as it can be when you are making a card payment? So I think after going through this journey, I'm able to appreciate the importance of it even more. Okay. This is at a very high level on how for those of you who may be technology oriented and would like to know how to set up, this is the kind of setup that was adapted or that was applicable to our kind of scenario. Again, depending on your case and your scenario, different kinds of setup might be applicable to you. I show a very simple version of this on the next slide, but at a very high level, this is how it works. This is an example of an in-person transaction. When a customer walks in and uses the PIN pad device, the information is encrypted using P2PE, as they call it, point-to-point encryption. The PIN pad devices are provided and managed by Grand Street, our solution provider. So we've outsourced that risk vector over there. Information directly goes to Payment Express, which is their solution. From there, it goes to WorldPay and gets processed, and the information flows from the payee to our bank. All that happens behind the scenes. So when I looked at this diagram, which was Grand Street helped me with this at the time, when I looked at this diagram, I'm like, wait a minute, why is my scope so much? Why am I being audited? I'm not doing anything, right? The only reason why we got into scope is because when the information goes from the PIN pad device, it traverses our network, and we were not able to segregate our network because of the, the framework and our landscape so broad. So a tip here for those of you who are, who want to achieve compliance and do it in a good way and a smart way is if you are not as widespread as we were, right? If you have 1 or 2 locations that's going to accept card payments, what you may want to do is segregate or segment that portion of your network so that only that has to be in compliance and everything else can keep flowing. Okay. So today we are 100% compliant. Over the last 2 years, we've added more channels. We replaced our IVR systems. So now everything over the phone is automated and very secure, PCI compliant. We've also implemented kiosk. We have a retail kiosk at a couple of Albertsons in Albertson location here in Albuquerque. If you happen to go to your grocery shopping at Montgomery or Quantaville, you might be able to renew your car registration or pay a citation in a secure manner. So everything that we do today, we have about 6 channels and on both sides of our business streams, and everything is as secure as we possibly can have it. One of the other things that hindsight, right? I feel we are very fortunate to have gone through this journey and done what we did before the pandemic. I couldn't imagine being able to continue serving our customers during the pandemic when our offices had to be closed. It is only because we were compliant and we had these existing channels that our customers were able to continue receiving the services. And over the past couple of years, the trend is on the rise. Online transactions as well as IVR, we are seeing an increase in card payment transactions. So customer behavior is also changing. Okay, so what next? I think what next depends on where the world is going. If you look at some of the top predictions, like Gartner or NASCIO, compliance, cybersecurity, these kind of things are in their top tier of items where people are focused on. So clearly this is here to stay. During the journey, during that phase a few years ago, a lot of my sister agencies, even us, our instant reaction was, let's stop that service payment from there. Let's not accept credit cards on this channel, right? Even today, when we talk to many of our jurisdictions in our industry, their instant reaction is, we've not been taking credit cards. It's too much of a hassle. We're not going to do it. But if you look at world trends, this is an excerpt from the next few years' predictions from WorldPay. Credit card payments were at a 38 point some percent in 2020, and the same trend is predicted all the way for the next 3 or 4 years. So this is here to stay. The other thing is customer behavior is changing. Customer expectations are changing, right? You do not have very many, my kids do not carry cash as much in their hands. They use Venmo and Zelle and whatever else it takes. So what is it that we have to look forward to on the horizon? Emergent technologies, of course, consumer behaviors, card changes, right? Back in the day, I had a card which I had to swipe to make a payment. Today, I have to insert a chip. Who knows what tomorrow holds? Maybe it might have facial recognition to unlock itself or my fingerprint. I don't know, right? But whatever it is, it's going to be exciting and better than today. And the compliance requirements are going to evolve so that we can continue doing that securely. Payment methods are changing. We have digital wallets on the horizon. So I think change is imminent. The other thing to keep notice of is, I've heard, rumor has it, that PCI compliance requirements itself, the next version is coming out next year, 4.0. So requirements might change. Today we are compliant, tomorrow we might have another project because there might be newer gaps. Whatever the horizon holds, I think given these lessons that we've learned in the past few years, we will be able to apply them and take the next step and make another journey. There is one important thing in terms of, again, now the important lessons learned in this part of the presentation. When we take on something like this, people look at oversight and compliance and audits as a burden. I think one of the things that was a good takeaway for me is every time we would start an audit, the mindset that my CIO would set for everybody is, this is a good thing. We'd rather have the auditors find a gap in our systems than a bad guys, right? We approach each and every audit with that same mindset, and we say it out loud. My CIO makes it a point to repeat that at the start of every audit. And that's the way we approach this. We want to provide more and more services, omni-channels, to all our customers in the best way possible, most efficient way possible, most secure way possible. And we don't mind extra oversight in addition to the things we already have in place to ensure and to tell us, to validate for us that we are doing the best we can to ensure security for our customers, because I'm one of those customers too. I renew my car registration using my card too. I want to make sure my information is secure. So approach something like this with that perspective and that mindset, and you will find it less burdensome. That's a big lesson that I've learned. Second, change is imminent. This is not something that's going to go away or we can afford to stay away from. We do not have a choice. We in technology have to meet the changing user behavior and consumer expectations and experience, and we have to do it in a very secure manner. So keeping the right mindset and keeping the right attitude will help us get there. That brings me to the end of this part of my journey. Thank you all for your time and listening to me and in sharing my story. Thank you. Have questions? Do we have questions? For those who are online, you do have the opportunity to submit questions via the portal. Those of the attendees that are here do have the opportunity to ask questions as well. I'm here the rest of the day in the conference. Feel free to stop me and talk to me on any specifics as well. Thank you.